The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the busy city streets. Cars honked impatiently, their drivers eager to get home after a long day. At one of the busiest intersections, a young man, no older than 19, weaved between the vehicles, carefully balancing a small tray filled with colorful candies. His clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together, but his eyes carried a quiet determination. This was his daily life, selling sweets to strangers just to make enough money to survive. As he approached a sleek black car, the tinted window slowly rolled down. Inside sat a man who exuded wealth. His tailored suit, expensive watch, and confident smirk were enough to tell anyone that he was someone important. The young candy seller saw an opportunity and put on his best smile. "Sir, would you like to buy some candies? They're fresh, and just a small pack can brighten your day," he said with hopeful eyes. The millionaire, a man named Richard Wallace, glanced at the boy with a look of disgust. He had no interest in cheap candy or the struggles of the poor. To him, people like this boy were nothing more than nuisances, clogging up the streets, making the city look untidy. With a chuckle, he leaned back in his seat and scoffed. "Candies? Do you really think someone like me eats street candy? How pathetic. You should stop wasting your time and get a real job." The words hit the young man like a slap, but he swallowed the lump forming in his throat. He had heard similar insults before, but for some reason, this one stung deeper. Maybe it was the way Richard laughed, or how the driver smirked at his expense. Maybe it was the fact that he was tired. Tired of struggling. Tired of being looked down on. Tired of feeling invisible. Still, he managed a polite nod and stepped back as the traffic light turned green. The luxury car sped away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a lingering sense of humiliation. The young man stood there for a moment, gripping his tray tightly. He had always believed that hard work and perseverance would eventually pay off, but at that moment, he wasn't so sure anymore. That night, as he counted the few coins he had earned, he couldn't shake Richard's words from his mind. His hands were rough from years of working, his body exhausted from long days under the scorching sun. But he was determined. He wasn't going to let one man's cruelty define his future. He had dreams, big dreams, even if no one else believed in them. Meanwhile, in his luxurious penthouse, Richard Wallace had already forgotten about the encounter. To him, the boy was just another insignificant part of the world he dominated. He had everything: money, power, status. He had worked hard for his success, and he believed that anyone who was still struggling simply wasn't trying hard enough. But fate has a way of humbling even the proudest of men. Days later, something happened that neither of them could have predicted. Something that would turn their worlds upside down. And this time, it wouldn't be the young man standing in the middle of the street, looking powerless. It would be Richard. Late that night, as Richard sipped on his expensive whiskey, he scrolled through his phone, checking his stock investments. He was always chasing more. More money, more power, more success. He had built his empire from the ground up. Or at least that's what he liked to tell himself. In reality, he had inherited a significant fortune from his father, using it as a stepping stone to expand his wealth. He believed in hard work, but only for people like him, people with connections, resources, and the right last name. The world, in his eyes, was simple: winners and losers, and that candy seller. Just another loser trying to survive in a game he would never win. But life has a way of flipping the script when you least expect it. The young man, Daniel, lay on a thin mattress in the tiny room he rented. With what little he earned, his hands ached from a long day, but his mind wouldn't let him sleep. Richard's mocking words played over and over in his head. He wasn't angry. No, he was used to people looking down on him. What hurt was the way Richard had laughed, as if Daniel's entire existence was nothing more than a joke. But Daniel wasn't one to give up. The next morning, instead of selling candies at the traffic light, he made a decision. He took every last cent he had and invested it into something different. A small risk, but he had to try. He used the money to buy a handful of second-hand phone accessories, chargers, earphones, cases. He knew there was a higher demand for these items than candy. If he could sell even a few, he'd make more money than he ever had before. Meanwhile, Richard was about to face something he never saw coming. That afternoon, as he stepped into his office, a towering skyscraper with his name on the front, he was met with a tense silence. His employees looked at him with anxious eyes. His assistant hesitated before handing him a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." On the screen, bold headlines screamed at him. "Multi-millionaire Richard Wallace, under investigation for fraud." His stomach dropped. Clicking on the article, he scanned the words, disbelief creeping into his chest. It detailed alleged illegal business dealings, tax evasion, and unethical practices within his company. Richard's hands clenched around the tablet. He had powerful friends, lawyers who could handle these things. But as he scrolled further, he realized the accusations weren't just speculation. There was evidence. Leaked documents. Anonymous. Testimonies. Someone had exposed him. His phone buzzed relentlessly. His investors were panicking. Stocks were plunging. And the media was already tearing him apart. In a matter of hours, his entire empire was crumbling. By evening, his accounts were frozen. Legal teams scrambling to salvage what they could. For the first time in years, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Fear. And just like that, the mighty man who once laughed at a struggling candy seller found himself struggling to hold on to everything he once took for granted. But fate wasn't done with him yet. A few days later, Richard's desperation grew. His once loyal associates had begun distancing themselves, his business partners refusing to take his calls. The high-rise office he had ruled from was now filled with whispers about his downfall. He could feel the walls closing in, walking through. The city, now stripped of the power and arrogance he once carried, Richard found himself at the very same traffic light where he had humiliated Daniel. Only this time, he wasn't in his luxury car. He was on foot, his designer shoes scuffing against the pavement, his expensive suit now nothing more than a reminder of what he had lost. And then he saw him, Daniel. But something was different. He wasn't selling candies anymore. Instead, he had a small setup, a neatly arranged display of phone accessories. He was speaking confidently to a customer, his posture no longer that of a desperate boy struggling to make ends meet. His business, though small, was growing. He looked successful. Richard felt something strange in his chest, something he had never truly felt before. Regret. But just as he was about to walk past, Daniel turned his head and their eyes met. For the first time, Richard was the one who felt small. For the first time in his life, Richard felt the sting of humiliation from the other side. He stood there, frozen, as Daniel looked at him, his expression unreadable. There was no smugness, no gloating, just quiet recognition. Richard swallowed hard. His instinct was to turn away, to avoid the moment entirely. But something held him in place. Maybe it was the realization that life had flipped the script on him. Or maybe it was the weight of his own mistakes pressing down on his shoulders. Daniel blinked, surprised to see the same man who had once looked down on him now, standing in front of him, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. He could see it. Richard was no longer the powerful millionaire in the luxury car. He was just a man who had fallen. A long silence stretched between them before Daniel finally spoke. "I remember you." His voice was calm, without anger or bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. Richard let out a shaky breath. He had no idea what to say. Apologies had never been his thing. And now, when he finally needed one, the words felt stuck in his throat. Daniel studied him for a moment before reaching down and picking up a pack of earbuds. "You need these?" he asked casually, as if nothing had ever happened between them. Richard stared at him, unsure if it was a test, a joke, or something else entirely. But then he saw it, the small knowing smile on Daniel's face. It wasn't mockery, it was something else, a second chance. Slowly Richard reached into his pocket, pulling out the few bills he had left. Not the crisp, $100 notes he was used to, but small wrinkled bills that felt unfamiliar in his hands. With a deep breath, he placed the money on the counter and took the earbuds. Daniel nodded, as if they had come to an unspoken understanding. He didn't need an apology. Life had already humbled Richard in ways he never could have imagined, and for Daniel, that was enough. As Richard walked away, he glanced back one last time. The traffic light turned green, and Daniel moved forward, selling to the next customer, focused, determined, and unshaken. He had found his own path, his own success, not because of anyone else, but because he had refused to let the world break him. Richard turned the corner, the earbuds clutched in his hand, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about money, power, or status. He was thinking about something much greater. Respect. Not just for others, but for the journey, the struggle, and the people who refused to give up, no matter how hard life tried to knock them down.